MeMic is an atmospheric stealth game where you play as a mimic hiding among objects to hunt adventurers. Explore a world filled with Easter eggs, secrets, and references. Find the perfect moments to strike and immerse yourself in a suspenseful survival experience. Welcome to episode 41 of the 5 T's of Stealth, where we will be discussing MeMic. Once again, the 5 T's include tasks, terrain, tools, threats, and tension. These are what I consider to be the fundamentals of stealth gaming. MeMic is a very simple game with no story to speak of. You're just a mimic taking down adventurers. In total, there are 5 levels with your objective being the same in each. Eliminate all enemies. There are usually around 5 to 10 enemies per level, so this doesn't take too long. This was pretty smooth sailing for me on every mission except for one. On mission 2, there is a downstairs area, and for whatever reason, some of the enemies would get stuck at the bottom of the stairs, making it difficult to sneak down to kill them and finish the level. This wasn't an impossible task, but definitely much harder than it needs to be, since again, these enemies are just walking in place, staring at the only way down. I had to slide off the side of the stairs and pray they didn't notice, which took a few tries, but again, I got there eventually. With the 5 different levels in this game, there are 5 different locations. While each location does feel unique and enjoyable to explore, there is just so much junk all over the place that it can be pretty overwhelming. The amount of items just thrown all over the map is just too much, and it really starts to feel like clutter or entering the house of a hoarder. This isn't the case in every room you enter, but it's definitely true most of the time. Each level is surprisingly pretty large, however, and you can wander around whichever way you like, and as always, I like having options. There are even some secret passages on some levels, which are basically just vents, but still it's an additional layer and it's appreciated. It's honestly a bit difficult to put a name to each location, so I'll do my best to explain each at least a little bit. The first level seems like a pretty generic dungeon area, but there's also some equipment in the area that makes it seem like experiments were being done. The second level definitely appears to be a treasury or vault, and the surrounding area including a tavern or bar. Level 3 feels like a cultist's library. There are books and summoning circles all over the place. Level 4 is most certainly a mine, and level 5 appears to be a mix of a crypt and some holding cells. Again, I don't really want to commit to calling each location a name since it's hard to say and there's a lot going on in each area, but I think this is a good enough explanation for the basic idea. I have to say, being a mimic is pretty damn enjoyable, even if the gameplay here is extremely simplistic. As a mimic, you have a decent handful of abilities at your disposal. Let's start with the most expected ability, and that is transforming into objects. There are a ton of objects in the game you can turn into, and all you have to do is walk up to them and press on the object. There is no cooldown for this, so you can transform back and forth constantly if you so choose. While transformed, and only while transformed, you can eliminate any enemies that get just a little too close. When you eliminate an enemy, said enemy will disappear in a little cloud of smoke. But be careful, because other enemies will react to this if they see it happen and hunt you down. If you aren't sure what you can transform into, there is a handy ability that toggles an outline on all potential options. However, the answer is that you can transform into basically anything. Now let's talk about the 3 active abilities that you can use, all with a short cooldown. First up is a smoke screen, which will briefly disorient enemies and provide some cover. Next, you can activate your sense of smell, which will briefly guide you towards enemies with a line that branches off for each enemy until it fades away. Lastly, you can bait enemies by throwing a coin to attract them to a certain location. This is pretty simple stuff, and honestly, quite broken once you get the flow down. Using the bait is simple enough. Just transform into an object, then bait the enemy to come close to you for an easy kill. The smoke screen is where it gets a little ridiculous. I'm sure the intention here was to drop the smoke screen and run for your life, but if I'm being honest, that is not the optimal way to use this ability. The loop I found myself in involved letting the enemies see me. Then as soon as they got close, I would smoke screen, then swiftly transform, and then kill all of them. I got pretty good at this and started getting quite a few multi-kills. If an enemy spots you, you can't just transform to get away, since they will still know it's you and eliminate you. That's why the smoke screen is essential in that scenario. I was pretty disappointed by the lack of unique interactions with the objects you transformed into. No matter what you were, a cup, a chest, a suit of armor, etc., every interaction was simply enemy walks by, press a button, and they die. I can't help but think it would be super cool if your object had a little animation. This wouldn't have to be anything crazy, but a lot of games have a short little animation for stealth takedowns, and I'm kind of thinking of the same thing here. Obviously, this would have been a huge undertaking for such a small team, but I would have loved turning into a suit of armor, and when an enemy walks by, the armor swings the sword it's holding. Another example would be this book I found in the middle of some sort of summoning circle. How cool would it be to transform into some cursed book and then spawn some sort of monstrosity? Obviously, that example is a bit more ridiculous, but I think you can understand my vision. There is only one basic enemy type in this game, and let me tell you, they are not very interesting. In MeMic, your basic enemies are adventurers, and while they have different outfits, they all function the exact same. Detection is pretty bad. If an enemy is suspicious, they will have a yellow eye over their head, and that eye will turn red once they've locked onto you. At this time, the enemy will simply run at you and start kicking. You will die in one hit, prompting a level restart. Enemies are much faster than you, so outrunning them isn't usually an option. As I mentioned earlier, enemies will notice when you eliminate one of their allies and will proceed to run at you. In terms of pathing, enemies will run around the map frantically, only stopping to examine or loot some object for a few seconds, then continue on their route. From what I can tell, they are on a predetermined path, so if you wait at an object they interacted with for long enough, they will come back to it. This enables the extremely slow and boring playstyle of just sitting at an object and waiting for an enemy to return. Enemies will stay locked onto you when you transform, so don't count on that as a get out of jail free card. There is one other potential threat I'd like to mention. On level 5, there is a giant trap door that you will fall into if you walk over it, and you'll end up stuck. Not dead, just stuck. This of course means you now have to manually restart the level, which is pretty funny in my opinion. I did some testing with this to try and bait some of the adventurers to walk over this door and fall in, but they just walked right over it every time. My theory is that as a mimic, you slip through the holes in the door while walking over it, since it's more like a grate than a door. Once you get the hang of MeMic, it is extremely easy and there's really no tension at all. In my experience, the difficulty came from trying to be very aggressive. This meant I was encountering enemies more often while out in the open. However, I typically was prepared with a smokescreen, so being out in the open almost just became bait in and of itself. As I mentioned earlier, it became very easy to just bait an enemy into chasing me while I camped an object I could transform into. They'd run over, I'd drop the smoke, then transform and kill them all. Overall, MeMic is a cool idea with pretty poor execution. I like that there aren't really restrictions on what you can turn into, but the way the objects are laid out just feels like clutter. I like the simplicity of the mission design, but just killing all enemies does leave a lot to be desired. My first thought for how to spice things up would be perhaps defending a certain object in the dungeon. As a mimic who just wants to kill and eat, it's hard to say that you need more than a kill all enemies scenario, but maybe there could be bonus objectives for getting those kills a certain way. The enemy design has got to be the biggest letdown of the game. It would be very interesting if different types of adventurers require different methods of takedown. Maybe mages can detect you, or rogues could sneak past you. I just think there's so many types of adventurers, and giving each of them one little mechanical difference would go a long way. Another way to make the adventurers different would be how they actually attack you. No matter what the guy looks like in this game, if they lock onto you, they run at you and they kick. Maybe the archer actually shoots his bow. Maybe the knight pulls out a sword and actually cuts you. These are little things that go a long way, at least to me. I look at MeMic as a proof of concept. In that way, this game is a genuine success, at least in my opinion. I enjoy playing as a mimic, I really do. I just think everything else besides the actual concept of this game leaves a lot to be desired. Hopefully, this developer takes this little idea and tries to make a bigger, badder sequel, because it could genuinely be a pretty cool game.